This is Brent Allan Winters, commonlawyer.com, and this is part 12 in our series concerning whether or not our United States Constitution is a biblical document with biblical provisions, and if not, which provisions are not in sync with Holy Writ. Two observations may be made. Number one, every decision that an individual makes, and he makes hundreds of them every day, every decision an individual makes concerning himself, or concerning his wife, or concerning her husband, or concerning their children, or concerning the next move to make in their business or their affairs, where to do business, where to live, whom one should marry and have a family with. Decisions too myriad to speak of here, but just to acknowledge that there are more decisions made every day than a person could make, and every decision that one makes sets a rule for one's life until a decision is made to change that course of conduct, behavior, or that particular decision one has made. A rule. It is a laying down of a standard to follow. And in doing so, when a person does that, he or she has laid down a standard beyond what is written in Scripture. In order to make what that person believes is right or wrong, we hope it's the Bible itself, but to make application to their own lives in particular instances that which is the best course of conduct. And we call those in our English-speaking world, for lack of another word and because of the limitations of human language, we call those laws. Now, our Bible tells us, it lays down a principle telling us that we are not to add to or take away from what is written in the law of God. God has made decisions too about what is best for his creatures, those he has created, and nobody knows better what is good for man than he who made man. Besides that, he has the absolute right as man's maker to lay down those laws. But when the Bible says we are not to add to those laws, as it does in the book of Deuteronomy, as Jesus seems to indicate clearly in the Gospels when he tells the leaders of Jewish Babylonianism that they, by their traditions of the elders, which later was compiled into what is now known as the Talmud and the Mishnah, by those traditions they have made void the law of God. He's saying you have added to the Bible things that are not part of the Bible, in violation of the mandates of the Bible not to do that. And John says in the book of Revelation that we are not to add. Well, if we are not to add to the law of God, then every decision we make about how to handle our particular circumstance, that, by the way, was not addressed or has not been addressed particularly and expressly in Holy Writ, is an addition to the law of God and making us guilty. Well, that's not what that means when the Bible says you are not to add to the law of God. Indeed, if we took it to extend to that length in our individual lives and our individual decisions concerning affairs over which God has given us jurisdiction, that is right, why then we would be stifled and frozen. As, by the way, people are in countries that are not under or do not practice the common law tradition. Because in all of those countries, which covers almost all of the world under some form of the Roman code, Justinian's code, it is the law and it is the policy of the law that where the law does not speak, men are not free to act. Whereas in our common law country, which is consistent with the ideals of the Bible, where law does not speak, where God does not speak, men are free to act. Simply put, as long as men do not violate some other law in their actions, they can choose what to do. That is God's way of dealing with his creatures, and that is our common law tradition's way of dealing with man, and the common law tradition is God's law of nature, unwritten, to say that our Constitution is an addition to the Bible that is inconsistent with the Bible is simply put untrue. Our Constitution makes no claim of being part of the Bible. It makes no claim of being perfect. In fact, it admits being imperfect because it expressly allows for changes and additions. And our common law tradition has always done that. Where the courts have ruled wrong, where the legislature have legislated wrong, wrong, where bureaucrats and clerks have acted wrong, those acts are ipso facto unconstitutional. Whether that it was said just that way, whether those unlawful acts occurred before our Constitution was written or after our Constitution was written, as our first Congress said on the 14th of October in 1774, the King and Parliament of England have denied us our rights, and that was several years before our present written Constitution was written. So I make the point again. Our Constitution admits that it is not part of the Bible, and as such, it is not, as Paul writes to Timothy, God-breathed theopneustos. It is, in the sense that people often use the word, however, inspired, and I made that distinction the last few times that the Bible is expired from God, and to use the word inspired is really backwards, and the word inspired we use to speak of things that God has given to our minds. We have nothing, not even an idea, that we have not received from above, whether directly or indirectly. And the word inspiration can be applied to those things that are from God indirectly, and I like to say our common law is one of those things, our Constitution, rather, is one of those things that comes to us indirectly, as our common law does, because it comes, as Samuel Rutherford so well pointed out in his 16th century writing called Lex Rex, or the law comes before the king, was his point. He says that knowledge is given to man through mediation of creation. In other words, God communicates to us through his creation. Just as it says in Psalms chapter 19, Psalm 19 says in verse 1, and it's quoted, Paul quotes it in Romans 1, refers to it, it says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament, that is the heavens again, his fingerwork. God teaches us through nature. He even says in Proverbs, as Solomon says, to observe the ant, observe the snake, and learn wisdom, and other things too. And anybody that's been around animals very much and has taken time to contemplate their actions will be utterly fascinated at what God has done. My brothers and I used to sit and watch. We'd feed the cattle in the evenings. It was our job. I was about 7 years old. It was my job and David's job to break 7.5 5-gallon buckets of corn. That means break the ears in half so that Dad could feed the cattle. And we'd do that. And then we'd wait for Dad. He worked in the oil field besides farming. And we'd wait for him to get home so he could scatter the buckets. He didn't want us out there among the bulls. We kept bulls and leased them out. And we'd sit and watch the bovine chew their cud. And we would count how many times they chewed their cud in their cud. In the wintertime, we'd feed them in the manger in the barn, and we'd watch them eat. And we'd watch the horses eat. Fascinating to watch horses eat. And then we'd notice the difference between the horses and the cattle, how they picked up the hay, and who wasted the most. And we watched how they'd get up off the ground when they'd lay down. You know, horses do it differently than cattle. It is the rear end of cattle that come up first when they get up off the ground, and a horse gets his front end up first. He throws his front legs out in front of him, and that goes up, and then the back end goes up. All these things are the fascinating design of God. And we'd watch insects and ants, and I still like to do that. I was watching the cats this morning. Had a little kitten, and I watched him play with a bird that his mother had apparently killed and given to him, and he didn't have another kitten to fight with, so he was practicing fighting with that bird. He'd sneak up on it, of course it was deader than a hammer, and then he'd pounce on it. And we have a nest of little birds out in the shed, and their mother's built a nest in one of the nail pouches out there hanging from a nail on the wall. It's utterly fascinating to watch her feed those little chicks. Well, I am overly fascinated with nature and animals, and I see how those things dovetail, those truths, how we learn from them, and how they dovetail with the written Word of God. Well, let's go to Article 1, Section 2, Clause 6 says this: the House of Representatives shall choose their Speaker and other officers, and shall have the sole power of impeachment. And he'll get to impeachment more later and flesh that out. He'll get to it. I'm speaking anthropomorphic. Our Constitution will get to that point. This clause requires the House of Representatives to choose and seat a Speaker of the House, and its method of doing so is the House's choice and no other. It doesn't say you have to elect your Speaker by majority vote. It just says that they shall have the power to choose their Speaker, and how they do that is their business. I have even found that with our Congress, if they don't object to something that was not duly done, it's awful difficult to overcome it. I discovered a judge once in a case in which I was deeply involved had not been appointed at the advice and consent of the United States Senate. The record was clear as crystal. Two senators had tried to bring it up on a vote several times, couldn't get a second on a vote to approve this judge's appointment that had, of course, been recommended by President Clinton. The record never reveals that a vote was ever taken. It just reveals people trying to get a second on the vote so the vote could be taken, on the motion to take the vote, rather. But then all of a sudden, he's affirmed, and he's been sitting on the bench for a long time. Whether he took an oath or whether he did anything else that would duly constitute him as a federal judge is an open question, because the record simply doesn't reveal. But those things are within the prerogative of Congress. I have no power over them. I do have the power, of course, as an American, to insist that all things are done according to the law. And I might add, in America, any right I have to say something about that, to object to it, does not depend upon me having participated as a voter in any way, and never has had. You know, traditionally in America, through the years, voter turnout's been less than 50% in any given election. And we often hear the unconstitutional, unlawful mantra, if you don't vote, you don't have a right to complain. I want to say clearly, in a free country, that is untrue, because a person's choice not to vote is a vote. And I'll add something else even more telling. Russia has boasted, especially during her communist years, as having a voter turnout of 98%, and then saying in America people don't even care because over half of them don't even go vote. Well, what Russia didn't tell you was that if you didn't turn out and vote, they'd fine you or jail you. Probably jail you. So voter turnout was high. Now, Australia, in not too many years past, passed a law making it a misdemeanor to not vote. Friends, neighbors, and relatives, that is an indicia of tyranny. One of the freedoms of Americans has always been and continues to be their ability to refuse to participate in government. And one of the great objections that Americans can make, and they can do it by a great majority, they can refuse to go to the polls. And if enough of them do that, that says something to those in government. And if government in America ever gains the power, not the authority, not the right, they don't have it, to pass legislation to command people to vote on pain of criminal penalty, as they've done in Australia, as they have done in Russia and all the communist bloc states, then freedom suffers a serious blow. So don't say that anymore. There's nothing in the Constitution of the United States that requires anyone to vote or requires anyone to participate. There's nothing that requires people to try to run for public office, and much less anything that requires them to vote. And to do so would take away the power of potential voters to speak by not voting. And that has happened and will continue to happen. Voter turnout in periods of great apathy, and I see that now in periods of great apathy, speaks loudly to those in power. There are even some people saying now that they're not going to vote, people that I never thought would say that. They're tired of the whole mess and they're not going to participate. Of course, that speaks loudly in this way. Ballots in America have been our alternative to violence. And when people quit voting, that says something to those in power. It is a way of saying that I will not, for one, participate. And a forced vote is as dangerous, as contrary to freedom and our common law tradition, as is a forced oath. And those have been around since the days of the Civil War. I have, well, our family have copies of the attempted forced oath of our family members during the Civil War and following the Civil War. I say Civil War, and I know it's a word that's objectionable to many, and rightly so. A Civil War, that was a word put in place by the victors. There was little civil about that war. In fact, that war was so uncivil that even the British recoiled and said, we're not taking a side. Of course, the southern states wanted them to, but they were so abhorred, their observers were so abhorred by the slaughter and the uncivility of the murder of southern men and women who refused to take the oath. Their murder even on mere suspicion, or just having been a family member of someone who was under suspicion of not being loyal to the North, were murdered. Hundreds of them. And those records have been hidden and subdued for now over a century. Pastors of Bible-believing churches jailed for the duration of the war because they refused to take sides by way of a forced oath. Well, the same thing is true of a forced vote. Enough said about that. Back to the Constitution. Section 3, Clause 1 of Article 1. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. Now let's remind ourselves as we're going through this that one of the greatest reasons there are 2 houses in the Congress of the United States is because the people of that day wanted to split the Congress into 2 parts because they feared the power of a legislature, and rightly so. I read about the colonies, the colonial legislatures after the American War for Succession from the British Empire, successful war. Legislatures in the individual colonies turned states were given great power, especially in Pennsylvania, and the rights of the people suffered terribly. You know, even after the English, what was called the English Civil War, wherein the Puritan parliamentary forces fought with the royal forces of the Crown and defeated the Crown of England along with its civil law, city law doctrines. That put Parliament squarely in charge in absolute sovereignty over the country of England. And immediately, Parliament began a campaign of the same things against their enemies that they had fought and died for, the same freedoms they began to violate, and did so with an absolute vengeance. Well, the same thing happened in the colonies turned states. They were happy to win the war, throw off the yoke of the king and Parliament, and then turned right around and gave their state legislatures power of sovereignty, and they found out that a single will of a combined group of men was as bad or worse than the single will of one man. A single will, friends, neighbors, and kin, is a single will. And if all powers are gathered into a single will, and that's what statutes and legislation are, by the way, tyranny will reign. Therefore, governments came to be fashioned after that of our Constitution in many respects, and of course probably the chief, foremost, ruling, controlling doctrine of our United States Constitution is separation of powers, and of the third branch, not the third branch, but of the branch of government taken from that common law trunk, that branch called the legislative powers. Those that ratified the Constitution consented to it because it was split into 2 branches, and those 2 branches often are contrary to one another, and the more contrary they are to each other, the more freedoms we'll enjoy. So here we have it in Section 2, Clause 6 of Article 1, and Section 3, Clause 1 of Article 1, the 2 houses of our national, I wouldn't call it a national legislature, that's not right, the legislature, as our forefathers said, of the general government. Now this clause that establishes the Senate of the United States requires that each state legislature pick its state's 2 senators for Congress. Amendment 17 that was put into place about the time that the income tax amendment was purportedly put into place, along with legislation establishing the Federal Reserve Bank, which is not federal and it has no reserves. It is not a branch of government, although it is given such exorbitant powers that it controls government. All these came into being about the same time and were all part of a monolithic plan. Monolithic, that means, almost couldn't pronounce it. It was such a big word it filled my mouth and I couldn't get it all out at the right time. Monolithic means a one big rock formation of government, all powers gathered into single hands. Well, that's anti-American, to say the least, but that's what happened about just before World War I during the administration of a felon by the name of Woodrow Wilson, who admitted at the end of his presidency that he had been a lackey of men in powerful places. Well, indeed, he was right about that. It's nice to see confession at the end of a man's life. He passed away shortly thereafter. But he was used to try to put in place a League of Nations, an international government to trump the United States, used to put in place legislation establishing a powerful private bank called the Federal Reserve Bank, used to put in legislation establishing an income tax over people's power to make a living, and finally, I'm referring to here Amendment 17, used to put in place an amendment that put the power to choose senators for the United States Senate into the hands of a majority of voters in any given state, thereby destroying the state's ability to protect protect its own rights. You see, the great danger that the common law mitigates against is the danger of the migration of all of the powers of government into the hands of a single will. And that will inevitably happen as the evil empire encroaches and reaches its slithering limbs into the halls of the government and of the people's minds of America, as is now happening. Now, in order to control who gets elected to the United States Senate, all that has to be done is to control popular opinion. Whereas that was removed from popular opinion, knowing the danger of popular opinion, each state senator from each state was chosen by the legislature of each state. You see, if the power to choose the senator of each state is taken away from the state legislature and given to the people by majority vote, then all of a sudden the people have little interest in who they will choose for their state legislatures. And it used to be, before that happened, that state legislators would run for office based upon who they would most likely support to be senator to send to Washington, D.C. from that state. That taken away, little attention was given, and is given now, to state legislature elections compared to popular vote elections of U.S. senators. I'm not alone in this opinion. Several have made this point and made it with great emphasis, including some of our Supreme Court justices over the years. And the reason for that is people clamor against Supreme Court justices to support and enforce the rights of states. But as Justice Scalia said not too many years ago, why would anybody ask me to support the rights of states? My paycheck comes from the federal government, and it stands to reason that I wouldn't be that supportive. Now, Justice Scalia, to a great degree, does try to support the rights of states, but he's making the point you can't trust a Supreme Court justice to do that, and indeed, most of them at this point don't. So only the states are left to defend their own rights, and that's not amounting to much these days. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 2 says this: immediately after they, that is, the United States senators, shall be assembled in consequence of the first election, they shall be divided as equally as may be into 3 classes. The seats of senators of the first class shall be vacated at the expiration of the second year, of the second class at the expiration of the 4th year, and of the third class at the expiration of the 6th year, so that 1/3 may be chosen every second year. Now, because of this language in this section and clause, after the first Senate seated way back in 1787 had done so, all this clause demands the Senate continued to follow this provision as each new state was added with 2 new senators. Consequently, with the exception of 2/3 of the first Senate seated, all senators since then have been elected to 6-year terms. But by staggering elections of senators, our Constitution gives us a stable, slow-moving, and sure-footed, regular body in the legislature. And this body is intended to be less blown about by the ever-shifting foolishness of political winds. Now, that's not to mean that this body is not otherwise dangerous, because it is, and history proves that. I just saw today or yesterday that the 8 senators that are known for being vicious towards the people's liberties are trying to put in place a national ID card that would take the privacy of the individual American totally away. Among that group is a man by the name of John McCain, touted as a conservative. Hardly so, of course. He and his family, going back at least 3 generations that I've read about, have been government dependents and have known nothing of what it means to be an American and scratch for his own food. It's as though he has been a 3rd or 4th generation welfare recipient. Well, he and others like him are out to enslave the American people. I can see this clearly. I don't even know if these people can see it. I don't think they understand. If they do understand, that exacerbates their crime. But if the next clause says, if vacancies happen by resignation, that is, of the U.S. Senator, or otherwise during the recess of the legislature of any state, the executive thereof, that's the executive power of that state, which would be the governor, may make temporary appointments until the next meeting of the legislature, which shall then fill such vacancies. That means if a vacancy occurs, a United States senator dies or resigns, or is otherwise unable to fulfill the remaining term of his office, the governor of the state from from which that senator hails can make an appointment, can appoint a senator to fill his seat until the next regular scheduled election, according to the terms of the Constitution. Now, Amendment 17 modifies this clause by changing the method of filling a senator's seat. When a vacancy occurs, the governor of that particular state appoints a senator until the people, not the state legislature, elects one, and that's the modification. Senators are still elected to 6-year terms, and every 2 years, 1/3 of the senators are elected and 2/3 are held over. To balance the Senate's slowness and with a quicker response to the people, the entire House of Representatives faces election every 2 years. Watch me close. That means that if you're a member of the House of Representatives in the United States Congress, you never stop campaigning. And having run for election for the United States House of Representatives, I found out that everything you do as a United States representative or as a candidate for United States representative in Congress, everything you do and everything you say is calculated as an act of campaigning, while at the same time, whatever you're calculated to do and accomplish whatever you want to accomplish. Is that bad? No, that's not all bad. It does make for an environment of which one has to be wary. But the United States congressman, the House of Representatives, because they stand for election every 2 years, that House responds to the people and their knee-jerk reactions very quickly, and in most of those cases rather dangerously. That is why the senators are put in place, because, and history bears this out, they aren't so quick to respond. Matter of fact, if the House of Representatives does respond quickly to the people, it often responds wrongly, and the United States Senate will hinder, or check that rapid knee-jerk response. And of course, that's what's intended. In all of this, we remind ourselves again that legislatures are dangerous, and therefore they must be watched. But as Sir John Fortescue pointed out in his 15th century book, The Excellence of the English Law, or In Praise of English Law, it's better translated, our common law tradition has what's called a political element, but it's an element that must be kept in check. And I remind you that our Constitution draws specific boundaries on government. It draws no boundaries on the people of the United States, but it draws boundaries on them, and when all else fails, as which it sometimes does, then the people of the United States and their opinion of what a House of Representatives congressman or a senator has done or will do is the final and powerful check upon that person. And the 4 militia clauses that are set forth as the supreme law of the land, that has to do with the way they operate. And our Constitution is specific about our militias. The militia of the United States, which is the people of the United States, a subset of the people, are the final check upon all actions of government. And though the United States people have forgotten the militia clauses for 175 years, that does not mean that they are not a part of the law of the land. It just means that which has happened, and as Justice Story feared would happen and said so in his commentaries on our Constitution 175 years ago, or about 175, he said he feared that apathy would bring us to the point that we would ignore these militia clauses, which are the paddulum. Some people say paddulum. They are the cloak and the sign that we are a free people. And we'll get to those 4 militia clauses in the meantime, if anyone's interested in reading about them. I've written a book called The Militia of the Several States, Our Constitution's Answer to Its Enemies, Within and Without. It's available at commonlawyer.com. You can read about it there. And next time we'll start with part 13 of our series on whether or not our Constitution is in sync with the Bible. And we'll talk about whether or not the power of impeachment is biblical.